One of the hardest teachings from Jesus is to love our enemies. As we just read, he said, you shall love your neighbor, uh, and you've been taught to love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now, I find it hard enough for us to love ourselves. For many, it's hard to love their families, and it's hard to love our friends, and sometimes it's hard to love our partners or spouses. So Jesus seems to be asking the impossible of us when he says to love our enemies, the people who are against us. And frankly, this passage is maybe one of the most ignored by Christians because it seems almost like from a different world, that there's no real connection. Jesus is talking in the abstract. There's nothing practical about it. But I think Jesus absolutely intended for us to live by that. I often said that to the degree that we love our neighbor, that's how we love God. But maybe a deeper definition is if we say we follow Jesus, to the degree that we love our enemy is the degree that we love God. So how can we get our heads around this whole idea of loving our enemies? We all have them. I mentioned in the newsletter, if you saw it, that I get hate mail. And I'm sometimes surprised that people will go to the trouble of reading my sermons and kind of attacking me very personally. And I mean, I don't take it all that seriously, but it's just the reality. If you're going to be in public life of any kind, you're going to have enemies. Politicians, consultants who advise candidates, people who think they want to run for office say, the day you announce, half of the public will be against you, depending on what party you're in. So when you're in public life, you get enemies. In personal life, we get enemies. And I'm certainly had my time when I was involved with politics and experienced that as well. So I guess I'm well versed with having enemies. We all have enemies. I'm guessing you've had enemies in your life. And the religious teachers that we study, and some we quoted today, they all had enemies. Jesus, who taught this whole thing of loving your enemy, right? He was executed by them, and he asked forgiveness for them in his death. Swedenborg, whose insights we read, he faced potential jail for heresy, and many of his followers were harassed and tried by their enemies. Martin Luther King Jr., who famously said, love is the only thing that can turn an enemy into a friend, was literally murdered by his enemies. I mentioned the Dalai Lama today, a quote from him. Dalai Lama had to literally flee his country and has been on the run as a refugee because of his enemies. So these great spiritual teachers that are teaching this are not disconnected from the reality of enemies that we all have. But what does it mean for us to love our enemies? And I'm going to offer a few ways that we could begin to understand this teaching that has helped, at least helped me understand it. And I think first and foremost, it's important to understand that love means wishing goodwill for the other person. You wish the best for them in this understanding. So whatever we might feel for a person, we may not like them, we may not agree with them, but we want what's best. Now, we often confuse loving someone with supporting them or agreeing with them or doing whatever they want us to do. But that is not really love. We know that from the way we treat children, right? A parent that lets a kid play with electrical sockets or eat sugary foods in excess or lets them stay up as late as they want. Yeah, the kids might think they're great and they might interpret that as love, but that is not loving a child. And it's true in our own lives. When we participate in people's bad behavior, we're not loving them, we're actually enabling them. Love means setting boundaries and limits, but it's still motivated at the deepest level in our hearts that we really want what's best for the other person. We have goodwill in our minds, even when we say no to them. In fact, sometimes we can best show our love by disagreeing with people. If someone is espousing hatred or lying, loving them can mean opposing them. And if we're operating from goodwill, we may genuinely show that love by disagreeing, opposing, even seeking to have someone arrested can be an act of love. What we have to be really aware of, and this is something only we can answer, is do we really want what's best for them? One good test of this is checking within yourself, within your heart, and asking, do I want revenge? Do I want revenge? Do I want to harm them? Do I want to see them suffer? That is not wishing goodwill. So we can love the person, wish them goodwill in our hearts, and not go along. And I think this is an important first framing of loving your enemy. The second framing I would offer for loving your enemy is along the lines of what the Dalai Lama was saying. He said, if you can, in another place, he said, if you can cultivate the right attitude, your enemies are your best spiritual teachers because they provide a presence with you and an opportunity to enhance and develop tolerance, patience, and understanding. And I feel this is a profound teaching from him, very much aligned to the teachings of Jesus, that the people that come into our life are often allowed to do that for us to grow spiritually. And we grow spiritually through challenges. And as I've gotten older, I've come to see that the enemies I've seen in my life have also been my best teachers. So trying to imagine the person right now who might be an enemy in your life as a messenger from God with new teachings and insights can flip the narrative. Yes, enemies irritate us and they can trigger us, but instead of taking the bait, we can use those moments to reflect. What am I supposed to learn right now? If you think about someone who has been your enemy or is your enemy and ask, let's say their name is Frank. What is Frank teaching me right now? What are they teaching me right now? And leave that open. We can use the enemy moment as a way to come to a greater understanding, develop greater empathy, and see the world through a different perspective. I think that's really important. One way of loving our enemy is to try to see the world through their eyes, understand their trauma, understand their challenges. Again, it doesn't mean justifying, it's not excuse making, but it is a very powerful thing to realize that, but by the grace of God go I, that they've had challenges in their own life and they're doing often the best they can. And their way of acting might be to attack. So instead of having contempt, we can have understandings, knowing that enemies are our spiritual messengers and we can learn to love better through them. And then a third way of framing this idea of loving your enemies is to recognize that they are us. Our enemies are connected to us. We were all created in the image of God, and we are all connected. And so there is a cosmic spiritual teaching, I think, that when we hate our enemies, at some level, we're hating ourselves. When we hold on to hatred, contempt, a desire for revenge, we are allowing poison into our souls. We may think that harboring a grudge or seeking revenge, it does feel satisfying, but it doesn't grow us spiritually. In fact, it rots us. I believe this is what Reverend King was talking about when he said, I've decided to stick to love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. The command to love our enemies reflects that God is working in our chaotic and evil world and evil events toward the good. That God is always seeking to take what is ever happening in our lives and move it toward the good for us. Doesn't mean we're immune to evil. None of us are. It doesn't mean we're immune to suffering. None of us are. But with God's presence in our life, God is always moving it toward the good. Reverend Gladish, who is the former pastor of a Swedenborgian church in Mitchellville, Maryland, and a reader of our newsletter and a colleague, read the newsletter this week, and he shared something I thought was important, because one of the areas where it's hardest to love your enemy is during a war. And the world is in a war. Many people in the world are in a war right now with the invasion of Ukraine. And that is often the toughest, because our tribal instinct wants to get in really deep, and we want to really demonize those that we're fighting against, make sure that they're evil and that we're good. And I thought it was interesting that he said that he was reflecting on this. And I'll just read a quote from him that he sent me. He said, "As I was reflecting on the war and the cruelty in this world and feeling a little bitter about having to donate time, energy, and money to help the victims of all that evil rather than being able to make it stop, I realized that I needed to write a sermon to get a better perspective from the word and the doctrines. And the more I looked, the more I found that reinforced the message of how important it is to stay positive, to look for the good, to willingly, even cheerfully support the innocent, even when we can do nothing about the evil that hurts them." And he closes, "We must remember that the Lord does not allow anything to happen unless it is for the good of ourselves and others." I think that's an important cosmic way of looking at it, in the sense that it's a reminder that God is working even when we're experiencing evil toward the good. So the choice to love our enemies or to hate them, really, is a choice about who we will be, not who they are. Loving our enemies can keep us on that positive and optimistic path, being transparent, even amid evil. So I hope these frameworks help you, as they've helped me, as I try to engage with my own enemies. Loving our enemies doesn't mean agreeing. It means seeking what's best for them. Loving our enemies means embracing that they could be our teachers. Loving our enemies means letting go of the poison of hate that rots our souls. In these ways, loving our enemies is truly a process of loving ourselves. Amen.